We're going to begin something today that we have not tried before, and that's called the flipped classroom model, where the teacher lectures to the screen about a topic and then asks the students to return home in the evening, watch the lecture, and then come to class with questions or issues that they have over the content. So we're going to try this with this unit. It's called the progressive movement. Now, the progressive movement really marks the beginning of the 20th century in American history. But historians have been a little bit uncertain as to exactly know how to define it. Most historians really regard it as the urban side of the same issues that bothered the populist. And although they have some characteristics in common, they're very different kinds of movements. The progressive movement begins in about 1900. You will find some professors who date it as early as 1890, and it really extends up until World War I, around about 1920. The progressive movement found supporters among small business, professionals, and especially middle class folks who lived in urban areas. The progressives left an important legacy for us, especially as we move forward into the 20th century and we look at the impact of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. So, what I want you to do is think about the progressive movement, and made a slide of the progressive movement that shows it more as an umbrella kind of idea that included a lot of particular subparts. So I want to walk through that particular umbrella with you. One of the most important elements of the progressive movement are the muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists who, in the early 20th century, took on the task of raking or uncovering the muck that surrounded certain political and social issues. They were sort of the forerunners of today's investigative reporters. Another important element of the progressives were the suffragettes. These folks have been around in American history since the 19th century, but beginning in the 1900s, there's a strong impetus to give women the right to vote. As you know, some western states had already granted women the right to vote, Wyoming being the first state. So the suffrage movement for women's suffrage becomes important under the progressive umbrella. There are enough populists left over with the issues that bother the populist that they come under the progressive umbrella as well. If you remember, some of the populists wanted an 8-hour workday. They demanded some kind of reform of the banking system. They wanted some kind of control over railroads. So populists are a part of the progressive movement. The temperance folks are still around. These are people who seek to lay a lot of problems that Americans had around the turn of the century at the foot of alcohol. The temperance movement has been around since the 1830s, but it gains impetus into the 20th century. It's going to culminate in the passage of the 18th Amendment. Some other folks that are under the progressive umbrella include the good government guys. Sometimes these are known to historians as the goose, the good government guys. These are folks that want to bring about reform in government, particularly in corruption, in the idea of the political machine. Other progressives included middle-class women. For the first time you see especially middle-class women who had some money, therefore they had an education, and they had some time to spend on some of these causes. They become interested in the general idea of reform. Labor unions, which have struggled in the 19th century, begin to come into their own in the 20th century and make some demands for the 8-hour workday and into child labor. Finally, under the progressive umbrella, you do have the civil rights folks. I'm going to be asking you to take a look at the DBQ, two major civil rights people in the late 19th century, and into the 20th century are Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. All right, so we kind of got an idea of what the progressive movement was all about. A period of reform that concentrates itself in the urban center of the United States and emerges about 1890 to 1900. It's an answer for some people of the many problems that were present in the 19th century, in Mark Twain's Gilded Age. Child labor, unfair labor practices, trust, concentration of wealth. Some of these were answered by the progressive movement. So let's go a little bit further. The progressive movement included a variety of kinds of reform. We're going to get the idea to tackle monopoly. And you begin to see this with the passage of legislation like the Sherman Antitrust Act. Into the 20th century, some progressive presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, will tackle the issue of the trust using the hammer of the Sherman Antitrust Act. You're going to see social and political, structural and political reform with the emergence of some ideas like the city manager form of government to help curb the power of the political machine. There are all kinds of social reforms that come back around at the beginning of the 20th century. Reduction in child labor, the settlement house movement, trying to encourage immigrants to live in cleaner, better kinds of housing with better water and access to utilities. And then there is this moralistic reform idea around the progressives that have to do with things like prostitution, curbing alcohol, curbing excesses of alcohol. So there's a very moralistic kind of element to this urban middle-class reform movement that we call the progressive movement. Okay. Some of the basic goals of the progressives you see here. As I've already mentioned, most of the progressives were moralists. They were very concerned about the morality of what they were doing. They tended to be Christian. They tended to be Protestant Christian. What marks the progressive movement and really makes it distinctive is this belief that begins to develop in the early 20th century that the only institution that's capable of handling the massive problems of society in the early 20th century is the federal government. And the federal government has a duty and a responsibility to get involved. Remember, in the 19th century, the government really kind of ran the post office and worried about military spending. In the 20th century, government is going to become involved in regulating the kinds of drugs that are produced in this country, regulating meat packing, regulating child labor. Government is going to become a tool of the progressives. They did believe in protecting the weakest members of the society, particularly children, and to some extent women. And this got them into trouble with some in the women's movement who wanted women to be regarded as equals with men, able to do what men could do, and then the progressive idea that women were weaker and would needed to be protected against unsafe working conditions and long hours in factories. The progressive movement at heart never challenged capitalism. It embraced capitalism. It did not embrace socialism, which was beginning to stir in Europe. The progressives did not embrace communism, which had its beginnings in the Soviet Union, or what will become the Soviet Union. They